We think this is going to be pretty interesting. We have some terrific talent, as they say, I'll introduce in a second. Speaking of talent, my co-moderator, Jay, who is to my left here, Jay Watkins. I think many of you know Jay, Managing Director of De Novo Ventures, has started several companies and run them, was CEO of Origin, of Gynacare, started Compass, the BD unit of Guidant, was president of several device divisions of Lilly, and most importantly, recently has joined us in Stanford Biodesign as a faculty member. So the goals for this session, we're going to focus on clinical and regulatory. Arguably, the toughest parts of getting a new initiative going. And the way we're structuring this, we have three first-time founder CEOs who in fact develop companies out of the Stanford Biodesign program. And they're going to share their war stories with you, and we hope to have a bit of an interactive session with that. So let me introduce those three to you briefly, and they'll tell their stories in just a little later on. So at the end is Brian Fahey at the far end from me. Brian is the founder and CEO of Niveus. He's a biomedical engineer, trained did his undergrad at Trinity, Hartford, and then his PhD at Duke. Next to him is Darren Buxbaum. Darren is the founder and CEO of Hourglass, an obesity company. He's a Duke undergrad in economics and engineering and got his MBA from Stanford. Then Marie Johnson is next closest to me. Marie is the founder and president of OHM Cardiovascular. She is a PhD in biomedical engineering, also University of Minnesota, and she developed their fellowship program at the Medical Devices Center, just a first-rate program. So we'll get back to those three in just a minute, but very much not least on our program is next to me, Peggy McLaughlin. Peggy is a Medtech veteran, spent 10 years with Target, but more recently has been a consultant in regulatory and clinical. And we asked Peggy to get started. Some of you we know are pretty experienced in Medtech regulation, but not all of you are. And so we wanted to just provide a little bit of an orientation just for a couple of minutes of the way Medtech regulation is structured, and Peggy is going to lead us through that.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Yes, so I've learned, I've worked with a number of different companies, and one of my most recent companies is developing an iPad app for used in the OR. And it's a very exciting project, but it's also a very, very, very young team. And so I think it's often helpful to put a little bit of basics together on the FDA process, because it can be really frustrating when you're a really smart person and know how to sensibly do things. And unfortunately, the FDA works with some arcane rules that they have to work with. So, so you need to bear with them as they move through things. Let's see if no, wrong button. To the right. There we go. Okay, so one of the first things I think that I want everyone to be aware of when you're developing a new product, especially in this day and age of both devices and digital health, and I know there's a digital health program going on upstairs, but one of the things you want to ask yourself is, are you really a medical device? Because if you're not a medical device that needs to be regulated by the FDA, run that direction. Don't make more work for yourself than you need to. So a medical device clearly is not a drug, and it doesn't function by chemical action or metabolic change. But also, you know, what's the intent of your product? Is it intended for use in the diagnosis of a disease or other conditions, or in the cure or mitigation of those diseases? So if it's not, don't go down that FDA path unless you need to. So a couple of basics about the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health. That's the division that oversees medical devices. And it's pretty new. It was formed in 1976. When I started in this field, things were a lot easier and took a lot less time. But it's evolved over time, and it plays a very important role. a lot of the problems that are seen with medical devices are related, for example, to software, but might be software that is controlling a very important life-saving product. So all the development of devices and even software has to be very well controlled. But the way the regulatory pathway works is it's defined by the class of device or the risk. So there's 3 different classes. There's class 1, 2, and 3, 1 being lowest risk, 2 being moderate, and 3 being high risk. And they're regulated differently. So you probably are familiar or certainly have heard of a 510K. That refers to the section of the Code of Federal Regulations that guides and controls the regulatory process for this class of devices. And what that is it's simply a notification to the agency that you intend to commercialize your product. I had some interesting conversations with colleagues here today. If you're not commercializing means going across state lines selling your product. So if you're not ready to commercialize, you might not be ready to go after that 510K or even register and list. But the 510K process can be used for a class 1 or a class 2 product. Those are the lower risk products. And the 510K process works on sort of what's called a substantial equivalence to a predicate, so an existing product that's already out there and already been cleared. The lowest class product is a class 1 that is exempt. That means it's exempt from the requirement to notify the agency. And those are really low risk products, and the requirement there is to register with the FDA and list your product. But there's also some other controls that go into how you develop your product. There's also a classification called a de novo 510K, and that's used when there isn't a clear predicate or similar device around which you can claim as a predicate. And that should be a relatively easy process, but it's one that's in flux, so I'll talk about that a little bit. And then the PMA is a pre-market application. It's kind of like an NDA for drugs, and that's a longer process and for a higher risk product. So just a little bit of background on each of these. The 510K exempt, you still need to follow what's called the general controls, and that's things like labeling your product appropriately. Depending on the product, you might be needing to develop it under design controls. So for example, if you have a 510K exempt product but it's software, you still need to use design controls. How many of you know what design control means? So a good number of you, but it's complicated and it's important. It also helps you, if you're developing something under design controls, to use what's called a special 510K, which is a 510K for some minor modifications, and it's a shorter time frame. Those special 510Ks are reviewed usually in 30 days, but you can only make those submissions if you're developing your product under design control. So the 510K, as I said, is similar to another predicate. The terminology used once you've gotten your 510K is that your product is cleared by the FDA. You would be liable to be misbranding your product if you say that it's approved by the FDA, and they're very, very much sticklers on that terminology. That time frame is about a 90-day clock for the FDA, and clinical trials are usually not required. They may be in a small group. The de novo, as I mentioned, is when there's no clear predicate and it's a relatively low risk. The downside with the de novo, there's pluses and minuses to it, but one of the problems with it is that there is no clear time frame around it, so it can take a long time to get clearance through the de novo process. And we can perhaps go into that a little bit more as we talk with our other panelists. And then the PMA, generally clinical trials are required. That product is approved by the FDA when you've gotten gone through the PMA process, and it's a 180-day time clock, so it's much longer, and of course your clinical trials generally take much longer than that too. So just briefly, the steps that you would start with when you're trying to understand what the regulatory pathway is. You would investigate the device classification. So the FDA website is both terrific and enormous, and you can spend a lot of hours on it. The biodesign program has a number of good website tools to help you navigate your way around and learn what you can find on the website. But you want to investigate and see what the appropriate classification for your device is. And then you want to consider and investigate predicates. So if you know of other products that are out there on the market already, you might know what your predicate is. But sometimes through research of your classification, you can find an appropriate predicate or predicates to claim. And then as you think about clinical studies, there's a range of options. There's a terminology called an NSR study. That's a non-significant risk study. And that regulatory pathway is a little bit shorter because you don't need an IDE, but there's some specific things that you need to meet to be an NSR study. An IDE is an investigational device exemption that's issued by the FDA. They're required to give you an answer when you submit for an IDE in about 30 days, but that can drag on back and forth with questions also. And then there's options and considerations that we'll cover a little bit more in terms of whether you want to start in the United States or outside of the United States. So that's our little primer on the FDA and regulatory process for medical devices.
So that was terrific, and we will have a chance to circle back and ask questions. I think what we'll do is set the context of the specific projects, and then that may trigger questions in your mind for Peggy to come back. And I think, let's go to the next, maybe I'll take the slides. I think, Darren, you may be loaded up first. Let's see if that's the case. Yeah, so if you could tell us a little bit about your technology, a little bit how you got started, and maybe not yet about the regulatory pathway, but just set the context, if you would.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me here. So my name is Darren Buxbaum, and I'm the founder and CEO of Hourglass Technologies. What we do at Hourglass, well, I'll start. Why am I even doing this? The reason why I'm trying to tackle the obesity epidemic in the U.S. and worldwide is, I've gone into the medical device space because I really wanted to change patients' lives. And I can't think of a more, just an area of greater need than the obesity and diabetes epidemics worldwide. And so what we're trying to do at Hourglass is we're trying to create a less invasive way to help morbidly obese patients lose weight. So to do that, we're actually converting procedures that already are proven to work, like banding and gastric bypass, and we're converting them into fully transoral, incision-free procedures that can be done in roughly a half hour and will actually be more cost-effective and should be safer than the current gold standard surgeries. So what we're looking at here is kind of the end result. So once our device is used transorally in the patient, we use it to kind of reduce the volume of the stomach, and our procedure is kind of shown on the left, and we implant the bands on the inside of the stomach, and as opposed to the traditional banding surgery, which places a band on the outside of the stomach. And the reason why this works is that you create this kind of smaller stomach just at the end of the esophagus. And when patients eat, they feel fuller faster, they feel satiated, and they kind of relearn how to consume a smaller diet. So that's kind of a small snippet about the company. I'm sure we'll get into a lot more later.
We will get into more detail. Okay, great. Brian, I think you're next.
Sure. So I'm Brian Fahey. I'm one of the founders of Niveus Medical, and we're focused on, obviously, a much different problem. It's maybe less intuitive, but everybody knows that patients go to the hospital, and some of those patients stay in the hospital for a really long time. And if they survive, that's great. What's often overlooked is the condition that they're in when they survive. Specifically, a lot of these patients become very weak. They're subjected to long periods of bed rest, et cetera. They have muscle atrophy as well as some other electrophysiological problems with their muscles. Really the end result, the takeaway of this is a lot of these patients survive a really gnarly illness. They can't even sit up in bed on their own, let alone stand or walk. They stay in the hospital a lot longer than they need to. They develop a lot of secondary complications because they're in bed too long. These are things like pneumonias, blood clots, infections, bed sores, etc. And it's all really avoidable. And we think that by solving this problem, and similar to what Darren was saying, using a device-based approach to mimic proven techniques, we can really change the landscape of medicine and focus on earlier rehabilitation in the hospital, prevent a lot of this weakness from happening, and if we're successful, not only are we going to improve patient care, but we're going to save the hospitals and the insurers a lot of money at the same time. This is just a photo of our device. It's a prototype version. It's in fact so much a prototype that there are different logos on the control unit as well as on our pad. But essentially our device, we have this control unit, this custom interconnect cable, and this custom pad that we developed, and basically it's a smart approach to muscle stimulation. So the core technology is a muscle stimulator. We have some advanced bells and whistles that are really novel to us, specific to the hospital environment. And really, we need to show that this works, and then we'll be on our way. So that in a nutshell, that's it.
Great, thanks, Brian. And special thanks to Marie, who flew out from Minnesota to join us.
Thanks, Paul. So I'm the founder and CEO of Ohm Cardiovascular. We are developing a non-invasive handheld device for detection of clinically significant coronary disease. Coronary disease is the #1 killer of Americans and also worldwide. Our goal with this technology, my personal goal, is to reduce the number of widows, widowers, and little kids who don't grow up with a dad or mom. 10 years ago, I lost my husband to a sudden cardiovascular event, surprise. I had a 7-week-old baby and a 4-year-old daughter at the time. And I am in this 100% to eliminate needless death due to coronary disease. I can't show you the device. I gave you a little picture. My industrial designer is a guy out of Chicago. He just won the Presidential Smithsonian Award for design. And he came out of IDEO and Nike, and so he wants to make this big market splash with the product. And so I sent him the slide, and he said, it's okay if you send that. We're just getting ready to start our clinical trials, so we've got all of our devices ready. We've gone through all of our design controls and all of our FDA paperwork, but I'll save that for later. And thanks for having me.
Okay, well, that is a terrific introduction. I think you'll agree. These are fascinating areas, and we picked them in part because they represent very difficult, I'm sure, different regulatory streams. And so let's maybe move into that. Jay is going to kind of lead the discussion. He said he was going to prowl among you. I don't know what that means exactly, but here he comes, so watch out.
All right. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I want to be able to move around a little bit. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. The sequence here is kind of interesting. I mean, there was a lot of talk yesterday about markets and opportunities, and commercialization is the overarching theme for the conference. And then we did reimbursement just a few minutes ago, and now we're doing clinical and regulatory. And one can ask whether we might have done it in the opposite sequence from really how we encounter the problem as entrepreneurs, right? Because we tend to have a program that needs clinical definition, maybe at the same time or maybe before regulatory approval, usually well in advance of reimbursement these days, and then ultimately commercialization. I think one of the things that we'll discover here as we talk about this is that there'll be significant overlap between this discussion and the one that preceded it on reimbursement. And in fact, there's, in the end, probably more of a simultaneous problem solving going on all 4 dimensions. And so we're going to try and get at that a couple different ways in this discussion. And I want to start with this sort of historic chicken and egg thing. I think lately, in fact, you've even heard this on Sand Hill Road, you've heard the statement, we don't do PMAs. And so the question is, what does that really mean? That starts at the very beginning and says, we select business opportunities based on regulatory pathway. That's, when you examine that, that's a pretty phenomenal statement, okay? And I think as the panelists will likely be able to comment on, there's no question there are, as Peggy pointed out, dramatic differences between 510K and a PMA. At least there have been, historically, dramatic differences. So the question that I would like to ask the three entrepreneurs we have with us today is sort of, to what extent really is this chicken or egg? To what extent do you pick a program or a project and then map a regulatory pathway and optimize that opportunity? And to what extent do you examine the regulatory landscape and then just use that as an input to picking a product?
And we should also, just to leap in, we should be clear on what your pathways are, right, for your different...
Indeed. If you comment a little bit on that, and maybe, Maria, I can start with you since I think it's pretty clear that you picked the project.
Sure. We're FDA suggested that we are de novo 510K.
Jay, you may be a little kinder than many investors. When I talk to investors about our project, which is a PMA, they said PMA stood for pain in my ass. But yeah, we're an obesity device, and they deem that a class 3, significant risk device. So we're in PMA all the way.
Why did you do that?
Darren, we've shared a little bit of the story of how you got in this PMA trap to begin with, in terms of your personal background and kind of how you got to the project. Can you just share that with us?
Sure. So actually, part of what colored my view is I was coming out of Medtronic, and I was surrounded by only PMA devices. So I thought, wow, I guess the whole world is just likes to do PMA devices. But for me personally, it was just a need that I thought was really worthwhile to solve. And it's from relatives of mine. It's from just did a bike trip across the country and saw that this is something that's really hurting this country. So I just felt passionate about it, and I think I overlooked and just decided, like, I knew when I looked at the project, I knew that a 510K would be a much more straightforward path, but that this was something that I felt that was worthwhile to do, and it was okay to be a PMA.
Okay. Brian?
So I have the luck, maybe, of having the easiest regulatory pathway, theoretically, of the members of the panel, with our device being a pretty straightforward 510K. We're taking an approach that's fairly common these days in medical devices, where we have a first generation of our product that is the simplest, most straightforward 510K, where then a little bit later on in our company's development, we'll be looking to get additional 510Ks that probably have more specific indications for use or marketing claims that will help us market the device into specific hospital environments and to claim the device does specific things. But at least from the outset and getting to market very quickly, our 510K is about as easy as it gets.
So Brian, you didn't look at the landscape and say, I want a simple 510K and then pick your project, did you?
No, for me, it was sort of in the middle. I think that we certainly evaluated all types of projects, and we looked at things that could have been a PMA to do, as well as things that were even exempt. And I think for me, the regulatory pathway, at least personally, was a secondary decision. Maybe it helps tilt the scales one way or the other, but I think really a lot of us share the vision that we want to make a difference in medicine, and oftentimes to do that you have to do something that's really novel and that might involve a PMA, and that would have been fine. But I think in my case, and maybe in Marie's case as well, we're able to find things that sort of fit the 510K criteria that can also make a very big impact that we're really proud to stand behind.
Best of both worlds. So just for the audience's benefit, it's an interesting group of three individuals, because you have this traditional sort of 510K, kind of straight up, very, very clean. Then you got a PMA, crazy. And then you got a de novo 510K, which is a bit of a straddle between the two with respect to the pathways that Peggy was laying out. So I want to talk a little bit about, so through various processes, you arrive at the project, and now you've got a map regulatory pathway. And without turning to Peggy, okay, you have to figure out kind of where am I, what do I need to do to figure out where I am with respect to this process and develop a regulatory pathway. We'll talk about clinical data here in a moment, but a regulatory pathway. So I just want to go, and maybe Darren, I'll start in the middle just for variety here, but
Sure.
I want to talk about how did you inform yourself about pathway once you had chosen a project?
Sure.
What steps did you take, and
So,
what did that look like?
so I'll tell you the steps that I took, and then I'm happy to share the secret of how to do it a lot faster. So, as Peggy was saying, I went to the FDA website. I, did a lot of competitive due diligence, looking at the other companies in my space, and frankly, it was fairly clear that intragastric implants from obesity fit the Class 3 PMA designation. And I even looked at, are there other uses for the device that could fit in a 510K? But to cut to the chase, you find somebody brilliant like Peggy, and that speeds it up a lot, and it gives you a much more realistic picture of exactly what the path is going to be.
Okay, great. Marie?
So I looked at the science, that's where I started. And I knew that we were most like an invasive technique. And so it was just a matter of trying to figure out how to convince FDA that our non-invasive technique was like an invasive technique, right? So we presented that to them and also several alternatives, and they came back and said, those are clearly not predicates because it's an invasive technique and you're a non-invasive technique. And so to be honest with you, we went back another time and suggested again another set of predicates that were non-invasive. And again, they said you're not a clear 510K pathway. And so to be honest with you, our strategy with the de novo, we're not afraid of it because it's really just a special controls document. We think that we have a good feel for what's going to go into that special controls document and are moving forward.
Maybe I could just explain a little bit more about the de novo process, given that Marie's in it. And that is, as she mentioned, one of the aspects and one of the reasons that the de novo 510K takes longer is because what's required is a brand new company comes up with a brand new product that doesn't have a predicate but is still moderate in terms of risk, and makes a submission very much like a traditional 510K, although clinicals may be required. Mm-hmm. But what happens is the FDA then has to issue a guidance document that talks about what are the controls around which subsequent submissions that are using this as a predicate device need to do. And so what a company wants to do is really essentially write that guidance document for the FDA so that when they make their submission, they say, and here's the work done for you, both to speed things up, but also to guide how you as a company would like to have your competitors, what hoops you want them to jump through. So for example, if you did clinical trials, you would write in your guidance document that clinical trials would be required. And so even though you do all that work for the agency, once the agency gets that and your submission, it still has to go both through the traditional regulatory path, and then it has to go to the legal department. And that has no timeline around it, and they, dilly-dally around all sorts of wording and all sorts of details. And so that's one of the reasons that the de novo 510K can take longer. And the other is that it's a process in flux because there's been a lot of pushback, as with the FDA, and that's one of the areas that they're trying to change, improve, fix, and so it's a little bit up in the air. That said, I don't think there's a reason to be afraid of it per se. You can be a leader and help them do it better by helping them along the way. So, but that's the special controls document that Marie was referring to.
I'm glad you brought this up. I was going to ask you, is there any indication if things work out well, what happens with de novo? I mean, what's on the table in terms of changing de novo?
I'm not sure what's on the table in terms of what's coming up. I think what would be nice is to have a timeline around it. I mean, that's one of the things that would help us all. I think all of us want more clarity from the agency on here's what's required and here's the clock around the guidance document that we have to write and the special controls. So that would be wonderful.
Can I add something onto that? So you can get onto the FDA database if you are de novo, and they'll give you typical timelines associated with the different branches that you're working in. And so our branch takes an additional 50 days about. So when you're planning out your money, you can know how much longer it's going to take. I know that's a guideline, but was it 5 de novos that were approved last year?
Yeah, not very many.
Yeah, so it's a really
I think it
small
was
number.
11 the year before or something like that.
And there's also a guidance document that says they're trying to make this more friendly for companies that are coming through the process. So we're hoping that that it's going to be really friendly for
If I can jump in with one more thing, it's just to remind folks that the FDA, they're just people. They're people like us, and they want to understand your story. So you want to help them by making your story very understandable. And then remember that they are stuck with these crazy rules. So what you can do really well is understand those rules, read them, reread them. When they don't make sense, there's probably a reason they don't appear to make sense, but the comma here means that they're actually looking for something else. Try and understand understand the rules and understand the arcane aspects of it so that you can give them what they need. I've been surprised when I've made submissions before and they come back with some comments, and then they'll have a comment that said, your statement didn't say, it was missing a clause. And I thought, well, how silly. But they need to see that exact wording so they can check the box and go, see, in this submission, it said this exact wording. Make it easy for them. Do things, if they say it in their regulation, spit it back to them exactly how they said it.
So Darren's up against the PMA. The de novo 510K's got some interesting characteristics, and the only one with the easy job is Brian.
Sure. It's very easy.
Piece of cake.
Yeah, piece of cake. For the most part, I'll echo the sentiments of what everybody else has said. The easiest place to start is by looking at your predicates or similar devices in the marketplace, seeing how good of a fit it is or is not, going to the FDA website. In our case, a lot of our early testing, there's a guidance document exactly for our class of devices that tells us everything that we needed to do right from the get-go. So in our case, it's very easy to map out and to figure out what we need to do. The thing I think I'll add is that one of the steps I think is pretty vital early on is to figure out if you're going to need clinicals or not, because that is going to feed into your budget requirements. And it's all about the money, especially when you're starting. And figuring out what you actually need is, I think, a pretty important step. But like Darren said, I think, at the end of the day, we're not regulatory experts. You can only go so far. Go find a consultant. Go find somebody. Even if what we did to try to save money is we did all of our own regulatory analysis in-house, and then we handed almost finished documents to a regulatory consultant and said, can you just review this, babysit us, make sure we're not doing anything stupid, and you can get that pretty reasonable. And then as we grow as a company, we're better resourced financially. That at that point we can engage in a regulatory consultant, I think, in a more traditional capacity.
Can I add something onto that?
Yeah.
So there are actually 2 types of regulatory folks that you can tap into. One is a CRO, and then the second is a strategist. So the strategists are a little bit more expensive than the CRO types. In my experience in working with other startups is that a lot of times the leadership will just take what they want to do and throw it over the fence to a CRO or to some regulatory group. I can tell you from experience, don't do that. Make sure that you're working with a statistician. Make sure that you understand your null hypothesis and what you're trying to prove with FDA, because a science project is different than what the FDA is looking for. Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, how do you find the right regulatory person? Any clues? And Peggy, you chime in here too.
They sit
but-
on a panel with you.
They sit on. Good answer, Brian.
Yeah.
Other
Yeah,
thoughts?
so-
I mean,
So the way that I did it, Paul, was I looked at our network from Biodesign, and then I always look for the smartest people that I can find. And so my regulatory strategist is now the head of regulatory at Medtronic, and so she's a great person to work with. And then David Feigl as well. So both of those guys I'm working with.
Comment, Darren?
Yeah, I reach out to other entrepreneurs who have been incredibly successful and who have had, I knew I was going to have a difficult regulatory pathway. I've reached out to someone who also had been through the ringer with the FDA, and I was like, who did you use? and that helped a lot.
Okay. So one of the things that Brian mentioned is this, the interrelationship between the regulatory pathway and the clinical trial. And oftentimes, I think what happens is that entrepreneurs, these days in particular, believe that data in its various forms is going to be important in this process somehow. And they may or may not talk to Peggy first. Talking to the three of you, did you reach out to the FDA? If so, when did you choose to do that, and why did you choose to do it when you chose to do it?
Well, I can start, I guess. So we have not engaged the FDA yet. There are definitely different schools of thought. You'll hear different things from different people. Actually, one of the things when I was interviewing, these regulatory strategists, I took that as an opportunity to survey them and ask them this question because I knew it was important. And I really got unanimous opinions from them, at least at the time, which was about 6 months ago. And quite frankly, they said there's so much flux and change at the FDA right now that unless there's a really good reason to engage them early, and again, this is maybe specific to our technology, but they said, unless there's a really good reason to engage them early, it's not worth it because you're tipping your hand, and what they tell you now there's no reason they have to stick with that when you actually come back for a submission 9 months later or whatever it is. And that's probably really specific to our case, but
Would be, yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what I was told.
Darren, on that same issue?
Same advice. And we've been talking a lot about the FDA, and honestly, my world is outside the United States for the foreseeable next, 3+ years. So in the obesity space, it's a place where there aren't guidance documents yet. The FDA is holding lots of advisory panel committee meetings, both closed sessions, open sessions, trying to get a feel for what the world should look like in our space. So it's in such a state of flux that, all of we're really focused on outside the U.S.
Marie?
So once you start to spend big money, then you need to make sure that you're talking to FDA. So we actually had our first pre-IDE meeting, and that's a non-binding meeting when you send your protocol, right, your clinical trial protocol to them and say, if we do this, will we get approval? And so their first response back to us was, and it's very friendly and helpful information. So their first response back to us, they made suggestions on how to modify our endpoint and also really how to lay out our stats. They didn't love those. And so we modified our protocol. We collected all of our clinical trial centers thinking that once we had made those changes, we were a go, right? It was time for an agreement meeting. And so we asked for an agreement meeting, and that's a binding kind of meeting. And flew to Washington, and we got a new reviewer. And we did, and he's lovely. We really like him. He's 24 years old, just graduated from University of North Carolina. And I said, I know some of your professors. I'm on adjunct faculty at the U. Anyway, he's a very nice guy, but we had a different team, and so guess what? So then
New
they
plan.
said, this is not an agreement meeting. This is a pre-IDE meeting because we want to make some more modifications to your protocol. And so I was nauseated immediately when that happened because all of our clinical trial agreements are in place. Our IRBs are approved for this protocol. And so now we, and it really, some of the feedback that they gave us are areas of controversy within FDA and even within the practice of cardiology. And so how you lay out clinical relevance, how you do review of angiograms. I mean, a lot of these things, we were going with the current and probably the best thought leaders. I mean, the people that are on my medical advisory board are pretty smart guys. But what we ran into is that when in question with FDA, they'll always default to guidelines from the American Heart Association, right? So that's what you need to pay attention to, because those are what their markers are. And then for things like quality control reads, are there any engineers in the audience, by the way? Yeah, a lot of you guys. So use your good judgment for engineering techniques, because you know what, that is going to inform you about what probably the issues are. So for me, for example, and I'm sorry for taking a long time, Jay.
Right.
So for us, we, when I was kind of reviewing how we would examine angiograms, they have a couple different techniques. First, the cardiologists do it, and then second, they use these computerized models. It's called a QCA lab. And you would think QCA lab, computerized models, that'd be pretty straightforward, but it's not, right? When I started to look at it, I realized there's a big difference in the way that different QCA labs work. Why was this important to me to look into it? It's because when you get bought by a big company, they go to QCA labs to make sure that whatever you are presenting them from your clinical trials is actually relevant and good data. Well, anyway, there's up to a 30% difference in the way that the different labs read these angiograms. And so I knew that as an engineer. I could tell because I sent these films out and said, hey guys, read them, give me how you would present the information back to me. So all along I kind of said, I'm an engineer, this doesn't seem right. Well, guess what? FDA knew that too. And so unfortunately I had to agree with them. I agree that it's not a great technique, but everybody else in the country, the American Heart Association, the people that are reviewing the clinical journals don't agree. They want QCA. So we're kind of caught in a regulatory situation, what scientific community wants, and then not having enough money to do everything that everybody wants. And so we are going to have to go for clearance, right? We're going to get our product out to market and then rely upon post-market studies to get the rest of the information out. Sorry, long-winded.
No problem. Brian, you picked the easiest path from a regulatory standpoint. So you're a guy who likes to do it easy, but I also know that you have a U.S. first, U.S. only strategy. That's clearly not what we just heard from Darren, okay? And I'm going to ask you, Marie, in a moment to describe what you've chosen to do, given that you obviously have been in front of the FDA with a dialogue, given that you're sort of a little bit in between. But Brian, can you talk about this issue of geography? Because I think it's probably generally well known to the group that people have tilted outside the U.S. for all the backdrop reasons that I think we've struggled with as an industry. So I'd just be curious to have you comment on, as you move into this question about what data, what regulatory forum, how do you resolve that? How did you solve it?
Sure. I guess it's multifactorial, really. We have a pretty big market in the U.S. that's very well defined, with very clear, access points, adoption cycles, et cetera. So starting at the U.S., to sell the product made a lot of sense for us, given the low regulatory hurdles. There are other ways that other countries practice medicine. It's just more fragmented, as everybody knows. So if you can start in the U.S., oftentimes that's a pretty attractive way to go about. From our clinical perspective, we were able to get our studies approved as non-significant risk. To get started in centers, we already have 2 centers up and running under that designation. Again, what it really comes down to for startups at a lot of this early stage stuff is it's really just about your cash burn. You might be able to get faster enrollment if you go to Brazil, but your patients and the travel and everything else might cost you 4 times more. And again, it's different for every technology, but our initial trial is going to have 5 centers, and there's just no way that on our budget we would have been able to support even 3 if it was OUS. So there's no real clean-cut reason, but for us and for Nivius, a U.S. strategy just made complete sense.
Yeah. Practical commercial, practical clinical, practical on the economic side, and a regulatory pathway that supported it.
Yeah, it was like a perfect storm of.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have a single good reason to go out.
Whereas now, Darren, I'll turn to you. So it's fragmented. Mm-hmm. You got to get on an airplane. it's expensive, and that's what you're doing.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean,
Perfect.
So, I mean, so why are we going
Yeah,
outside?
why are you
going outside the U.S.?
Aren't you following Brian's great example?
Well, you know,
You're so foolish.
we
You're so
yeah,
foolish.
we like to be world leaders in the U.S. and we are in obesity, but you know, the rest of the world isn't far behind, and there is a significant market for us and significant patient populations in almost any country I shouldn't say it, but in many countries around the world. So when we look at how long it's going to take us to do a pivotal trial in the U.S., get PMA approval, you know, to us it's a no-brainer that we should go outside the U.S., go to Europe, and get a much more straightforward CE mark. And just to kind of give you a sense for what that difference is, you know, in the U.S., when we're talking about a trial that we're going to have to run, before we even get to that 180-day clock that Peggy was talking about, we have to run at least a 1-year primary endpoint trial, which is probably going to take 6 months, say another year to enroll. So it's probably 2 years plus the 180-day window to wait for the FDA if they come back and don't have any questions, and so we'll call it 3 years. As opposed to in Europe, right? In order to get on the market, we're talking about roughly that would be probably a 300 patient trial. In Europe, let's say a 30 to 50 patient trial, 6-month primary endpoint. That's something that, even with any regulatory delays, within 1 year of starting that trial, we could be on the market and commercial. So so why are we going overseas? That's where our market's going to be. So we're working with centers of excellence in Europe, places that we want to be our initial commercialization sites as well. And so they're getting a great learning opportunity with our technology. We're getting great clinical data from them. And then that's our platform for launch.
Darren,
sorry.
sorry, Darren, I was going to say one of the things that we hear strategically too is that if you have a company where your exit pathway is going to be acquisition, there's a great deal of money that the multinationals have outside the United States for acquiring companies. Did that factor into your logic at all?
So, I mean, it's a great point. What really factored in was, the value of our company is going to be directly correlated with the value of our clinical data. So we just wanted to go and make sure that we can get the most robust and the greatest quantity of clinical data, and that was going to be outside the U.S. for some of the reasons that Marie said. I mean, the ethics committee approvals and the Ministry of Health approvals, we're approved in multiple countries already to run these studies. And I know we would still be waiting, in the U.S.
And Marie, you've obviously had dialogue with the agency around this middle path. What role, if any, has OUS geography played in your thinking?
Yeah, it played a big role because early on a Chinese firm contacted us and wanted to make an equity investment. And we thought long and hard about it, but opted to not do that at this point. We're going to launch in the U.S. We're going to start selling pending FDA approval October 2013. We're all very excited about it. And we're going to immediately go into the Indian market. And we've done a lot of study there. I actually went to India last year and was able to scan 70 people in 3 hours. 70 people in 3 hours. So there's a lot of people that need to be checked. And here's why. I'm a person who goes on passion and on heart. And I started thinking about the devastation that a sudden cardiac event would cause to a family. And in India, it's, the results of something like that are pretty significant. And so I want to make a big difference. In addition to that, there's no underlying diagnostic structure really in place right now in India to handle mass screening. I guess that's probably the basics.
Thanks. If we look at the regulatory frameworks that Peggy put in front of us, albeit from a U.S. perspective, they all require varying levels of data collection. But it historically has been around safety and efficacy. And we had this discussion in this room here a couple hours ago about reimbursement and the link that reimbursement represents to commercialization. And I just want to ask you guys as a group, as leaders of your organizations in an earlier phase of development, to what extent are you thinking about clinicals as needing to incorporate outcomes and economic factors looking forward? So Darren,
Sure, happy
maybe
to
I'll
jump
go.
in.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a walk before you run for us. So first we want to make sure that our technology helps patients, it works. But the importance of reimbursement is it's so incredibly important that for our future studies we already have it linked in, and looking at length of stay and other outcomes that could show better cost effectiveness with our technology. We're somewhat careful because we want to ensure that our studies that are meant for regulatory approvals don't go out so long that just to get all the reimbursement data that we're missing a commercialization opportunity. But frankly for us, we're going to be running trials well beyond the point. Actually, I should step back. So like take Europe for instance, where we're going to be running our trials for CE mark. We know that with a relatively short study, a 6-month study, we could get on the market. But we are running the clinicals for that to go well beyond that, because we want to look at reimbursement issues, and we want to look at market adoption issues. We want to give the data that physicians are going to feel comfortable, making their choices about what technology they use. So it's great in that situation. We'll be able to use the same data for both regulatory as well as reimbursement and marketing. Sometimes you have to break it up though, and do phase 4, post-market studies.
And Ron, if I think about your case, again, you got the really easy job. You're 510K, right?
Sure.
Clinical work and CPT codes. How are you thinking about that? Because you're also targeting the U.S. market.
Yeah, it's sort of strange in one way because we have a very straightforward, very easy regulatory pathway, but at the same time, our clinical endeavors are by far the most important thing that we're doing as a company. And it's just like Darren said earlier, to echo his sentiment, the value of our company is directly related to the quality of our clinical data. That's really all it is. So a lot of our work is, it's not doing clinical work to support a regulatory filing so much as it's doing clinical work to get market data, to show that you are improving patient outcomes. And the name of the game is cost-efficient improvements in healthcare. We think that we can show that, and by measuring all these secondary endpoints in our trial, it's going to help physician decision-making. Which patients are we going to prescribe this to? How frequently are we going to use it? Et cetera. And that's incredibly important to us. There's nothing more important.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're in a category where you could almost do minimal, if maybe even no clinical demonstration or trial and get a 510K.
Yeah.
Potentially.
So the first generation product would not require any clinical data at all, but we're doing it anyway. Yeah. Partially to support the market, partially to support the company in the investment and capital community. And then partially to help support future claims.
Future claims. Okay. So again, you see sort of the clinical piece integrated in a case where you really have a straightforward regulatory pathway. The clinical comes in and it becomes much related to the downstream considerations about building value.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we're making medical devices, and looking at literature and the common sense thing that this should work is only going to get you so far.
So far.
You're making medical device. At some point, you have to shut up and show that it works.
Yep. And before I come back to you, Darren, on this, one of the comments that you hear commonly, and I think more commonly, is the statement that Europe isn't a country.
Sure.
And you in your comment, you said, well, I got 11 centers, and One of the challenges for startups is that Europe isn't a country, and so when you come to this issue of data collection and reimbursement, I mean, I mean, are you doing that in everywhere?
Yeah. Okay, so no, you're right. Europe is not a country. Now, getting clinical trials approved has been a very straightforward and wonderful experience. Even working with multiple different ministries of health. Now, getting reimbursement is going to be a whole other story. And frankly, that's another one where I've already been meeting with consultants on to think about that and say, okay, well, which country is going to, or do we have a code, pre-existing codes that we may be able to fit into, which have, because different countries have advanced technology type payments, so for new technology, you may be able to get this, very nice code for a year or 3 years or sometimes even 5 years, just to kind of seed the market with your technology. But yeah, every country is different. It's it's a whole nother ball of wax.
Well, and for those of you who have participated over there, I'm sure you'll agree, we spend a fair amount of time saying that the FDA is in flux. There's no question that those systems are in flux as well, country by country, and pan-European as well. Leave out the whole India-Asia kind of considerations. Marie?
So we brought a reimbursement person on staff right away because we knew that this was going to be a challenging problem. And actually, I have this group called Argenta on retainer now. We pretty quickly realized that we should go for an unlisted code because, take this away, Cat 3 is bad. Don't go for Cat 3. And so with an unlisted code, what we had to do was project out what the costs associated with that. And so it's strategy development, right? So we start with our pretty narrow indication for use. And then we go into the larger population kind of studies. And so larger population implies more money, right? And so we have about a 4-stage strategy for our clinical studies. The last one, of course, is that NIH pays for it, which is the goal, of course. That was a joke. Thank you. I'm not funny. Okay. So our first one is this narrow indication for use clearance for market, right? Because that's really important with the people that you're trying to raise money from. The second one is a comparative effectiveness thing. And I don't know if it was here or the last lecture where they were talking about this, where you were comparing money with qualities. And then probably the third is outcome studies, which is really the big kahuna, right? If you can really show that you're making a difference in the way that clinicians are treating patients, you've got the big win. And so as far as reimbursement goes, Jay, my budget shows that I have a person in an office writing appeal letters for 2 years.
Yep.
And so that.
Well, and that's probably normal in many projects, I would say.
Could you repeat the first one again, please?
Yes.
The first of the 3 considerations.
Sure. Okay, wait a minute. Let me think. Okay, so the first one is clearance, right? So you can sell the product for a narrow indication, and I just have to tell you this joke because in patents they say that the rule is it's the 2-finger rule when you write a claim. If it's 2 fingers width on the paper, so we're saying that our indication for FDA approval is 3 fingers. It's like all of these things. So, anyways, that's the first, and then the next one is you do comparative effectiveness, right, to show that you're as good as the other devices or whatever that are on the market, and then we're also doing outcome studies. And I forgot, the last one was, are we actually changing the way that doctors are prescribing or whatever they're doing? So it says 4.
Yeah, just an observation, and you can hear it a little bit in this. On the clinical side, there's always this construct that we throw out that says, well, we have primary endpoints and then we have secondary. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, if you don't pay enough attention to the secondary endpoints, and you get sort of face first led by the notion of primary endpoint, you're probably not taking advantage of the structure of that clinical trial relative to some of these other things like, did we have an impact on practice patterns? Did we change behaviors in the way medicine's delivered? And as the reimbursement panel, I think, was touching on, if you move too fast through that trial design don't at least consciously, deliberately, either incorporate or choose, as I think, Darren, you've sort of done to some degree, choose consciously not to incorporate certain of those elements with a plan to come back later, then you're going to find yourself potentially with some stress between your clinical program and the movement into reimbursement issues and ultimately commercialization. It's pretty common to see that.
Yeah, just to point out one thing, when we first when we wrote our first clinical protocol, we had everything in there, including the kitchen sink. And our technology is so attractive that the principal investigators were going, yeah, we can do this, but they were doing it with a pained look on their faces because we're asking them to do a tremendous amount of work. And what we realized was, well, we needed to get to a point where there was some practicality to, what they use as their ordinary clinical practice, and how often patients were coming back. Because when you're running studies for a year or over a year, you're asking patients to come back a lot. That's a burden on their lives. That's a burden on the clinicians. And so you kind of need to strike a balance. And so you have to really pick what's absolutely critical, what's important, and maybe build on top of it throughout a series of studies.
Yeah. Peggy, I'd be just curious, when you see these, because you see all the trials coming through, how are you seeing people in these positions incorporate these other aspects of clinical trial design into?
So I think pretty much everybody is considering it, but I think like Darren, they often end up moving it to the next phase.
To the next phase.
Because it can, extend your follow-up period, and you really want to at least get there, get the clearance, get on the market, and once you're on the market, it's a lot easier to then collect all the other information. So I think it's important for everyone to be considering it, and if it's easy to capture quality type of information, great, but it's more being aware of it and planning for it than actually putting it in your first trials.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I will tell you from just my own perspective as an investor in the space, we tend to ask first, does this work? It's not a really sophisticated question, but most of the innovations that come in for early stage investing, they have big questions around them on safety and efficacy. And so we probably have participated willingly in the processes that have pushed reimbursement and commercialization considerations later in the sequence, because we also don't want to spend any additional money talking about planning to sell something that we don't know if it works. And so there is, to a degree, I think, a sequencing that it does naturally occur of these kinds of issues. I will also tell you as an investor that I've been in more than a few companies where we now know it works, and we've got somebody in a room on the telephone going one payer at a time to try to get a business built, and it is very, very, very painful. So I think we're still in a process of bringing that to an optimal kind of strategic approach.
Well, one of the things that you can consider is that it's not just about qualities or outcome measurements, it's about quality of the clinical data and then publications in peer review. So if you can plan early on for the publication aspect, that's very important for the reimbursement part of things. And I think companies sometimes neglect that when they get the, yay, we're cleared, let's go, but you need to keep pushing forward and getting those peer-reviewed publications out there, because that's what the payers
I would
want to
agree
see.
with that. The comment was made, I think, briefly again in the other session around this clinical data collection that, we didn't realize we had to have a paper.
Yeah.
Well, what happens when
Two
you go to the
papers.
payers is it's really cool. You bring the paper, and then they go, we need a second paper.
Yeah.
No, it's literally true,
it's
as
two
you know,
papers.
in several cases. So this issue of understanding how to reverse engineer that process so that you can anticipate what their real requirements are before they'll open that gate, okay? is really important. And if you don't center these clinical data collection programs in the right kind of frameworks, then you aren't going to get the quality, then you aren't going to have the paper opportunities, and the thing builds into a house of cards. So it's very, very important. Paul?
I'm thinking we may want to
Yeah.
ask for some questions.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
So, okay. So we want to open it up and take advantage of the experience that's up here on the panel for the group to ask any questions that you may have. And let me just walk around, because that's probably the easiest way to do this.
So you guys mentioned you mentioned going to India and doing clinical trials there first because of the FDA problem. And I was wondering, is that a good idea if you want to find more data and maybe go and prove that it's marketable over in India or another country that's very easy to get FDA approval in, and use that research or that support to get your FDA clearance?
Can I answer that, you guys? So we won't take clinical data in India. What I was doing was more market research to kind of see what was going to happen. I think that you have to think GCP, right? You have to follow a lot of protocols and go through a process of verification and validation of whatever database or however you're going to collect the data. And I think that in India it's still suspect that a lot of the hospitals haven't been trained on those. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think there are really good clinical trials that are happening there, but we're too small to take that on. I mean, we don't want to have to overcome any kind of extra stuff in terms of doing that. For Indian approval, by the way, we would use our FDA data because it is under GCP. And then there's an additional process of having to go through, there's two regulatory bodies, one's the state and then one's kind of the national, like the national kind of stage as well. Yeah.
So I have a slightly different take on that, and we work with a large corporate player, and they were actually very comfortable with data from India and data from other countries. So long as the site selection, I mean, it takes a lot of time in the site selection and working with certain principal investigators and certain very well qualified clinical staffs. But there are CROs that can help you navigate that in various different countries, and so we've done work in different countries, and I would just say, feel very comfortable with the principal investigator and their staff. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the number one thing. And if you feel comfortable about that and they have a good track record, then that's a good place to work.
I was going to also mention that for another client recently, we submitted to the FDA for a feasibility IDE, and the FDA is more likely to give you their response to a feasibility IDE in that 30-day time period. So we submitted to the FDA for a feasibility IDE, and at the same time started studies, went through the submission process in Europe and did a larger study there. And those two items dovetailed. We then submitted all the data for our CE mark, already have the CE mark, and have submitted the 510K and are waiting for that response. So it can work together, and for this company that has sales and salespeople already out there and is moving into the European market, it's a very nice, they already have that clearance, they can start selling in Europe, and they have other things that they're already selling in the United States, but they'll add this to their repertoire as soon as they get clearance.
That's great. Thank you.
So my question was for Brian and Peggy. So you said you have a device which has the simplest 510K path, and you are still working on getting clinical trials done on it so that you have data for future claims and marketing. And the question was that what class of devices is it in which you can do clinical trials before getting a IDE or 510K on them?
Sure. So I'll answer your question the best I can, and then Peggy can correct everything I say.
I'm sure you got it right.
So our ultimate product is likely to be a class 2 device. There's actually proposed draft changes and documents that are scheduled to, who knows when they'll be implemented, but probably within a year. That a lot of the core technology, not the things that we're working on, but core muscle stimulators that don't have all of our additional technologies and bells and whistles, those are actually going to become class 2 exempt. So it's even more changes at the FDA. But for our trial, really the key thing here is we were able to use a prototype system and make a successful argument, at least at 2 centers so far, that it's classified as a non-significant risk trial and non-significant risk device. And that's really the key component to not having to go through the IDE process. If we had our own device, but let's say that we had the same exact device, but we were doing something else in the trial that would be considered more risky. If we wanted to take muscle biopsies or do something that was more invasive, that could completely be a game changer in terms of the trial structure and going to the FDA, even though we're using the same exact device and the same exact treatment protocol. So it's really more all-encompassing.
The non-significant risk designation is something that a company actually, or a sponsor or the investigator makes the justification for why it's non-significant risk. So the FDA has a specific definition. For example, it can't be an implant. So for your product, Darren, you'll never be a non-significant risk. One could argue that yours might have been.
We are an NSR.
Yeah.
Yep.
So if you have a product that the risk is truly minimal for the patient, then what the process is, the FDA says, okay, we give the regulatory oversight to the IRBs. So the company makes a justification and submits the rationale for why it's a non-significant risk device and study to the IRB, and then the IRB either agrees with you or doesn't agree with you. It's a little bit tricky because if they don't agree with you, then you have to go to the FDA and ask for an ID or abandon the study.
If any IRB
If
doesn't.
any,
If any
if
IRB.
any one IRB.
Yeah, so you want to kind of really understand, the IRBs you're working with, and or be very, very comfortable about the NSR status of your product, which, yours makes sense to me that it's a non-significant risk. And as Brian said specifically, if, the device can be non-significant risk, but if the study has an aspect like a muscle biopsy, then it becomes not a non-significant risk. So you may just focus your study specifically to be a non-significant risk.
And just to build on that ever so slightly, I mean, it's a calculated risk as a company to go and not get an IDE. I mean, we have approval at 2 centers. We're trying to do up to 5. I mean, we could be approved at 4 centers and enrolling patients. That one IRB comes back, the 5th one, and says we don't agree. I mean, shut it all down. Go to the FDA, and I mean it's curtains. It's bad news. So you have to be really darn sure before you start down that path.
Okay.
You said that you have to get the trials done at least at 5 centers. Is it a limit that there has to be data collected?
You've
from 5
chosen
centers?
to,
No, we just chose.
restrict it to 5, right?
Yeah, the reason we went with 5 centers is just to accelerate the enrollment, hit our target patient numbers, faster.
Guy, and I'll bring it back to you. Okay, excuse me. All right. Sorry. Yep, should be on, right?
Jay, sorry, can you turn the mic on? Apparently it's not
Is it
on.
not on? No, maybe it was kicked off.
It's a puzzle.
Is this on? Hello?
It's at the very bottom.
Very bottom.
Have him speak into your jacket.
Yeah.
I'm glad to see that there's something that's harder than clinical and regulatory.
Yeah.
Technology.
Yes.
Got it.
Okay, back to life. So first of all, thanks for the discussion. Great panel. Masood Roham from Y Medics. I have one comment regarding the the discussion about testing the device in countries outside United States, and one question for the panel. The comment is that, just don't assume that, like we've done this mistake before. Don't assume that you can take your device in your suitcase and take it to a different country and talk to an investigator because the export license, there's some paperwork in regarding to that. So that's the first question. That's the first comment, and the question is that I basically just want to know that like the claim that you put on your device, does it change the classification of the device for FDA, assuming that you're measuring some data? If you are just saying that I'm measuring that data and transfer it to the doctor, is it makes any difference with saying that I'm measuring this data and doing some clinical decision based on that, and then transfer the result to the doctor? In terms of safety, or do you think like the FDA put these two in two different classes, or no? Thanks.
Did you understand the?
I think so. I think it's.
Okay.
And I don't know if that was more for Marie, because you talked a little bit about the claim that you're going for sort of in the second piece. But what your labeling is very much affects what your class is of your device. And so you want to look at that carefully in the classification system. And I think, as Brian said, they're starting, for example, with sort of generic labeling that is a particular class, and then they're going to build on that using their first clearance as the predicate for their second clearance, and they're going to demonstrate through clinical studies, I presume, or further testing, that it also does this additional thing that they're going to claim in their labeling.
Peggy, I'd just be curious from your perspective, again, because you see so many of these. Do you see that strategic approach to approvals becoming more common, given that it's become generally more difficult, particularly in the U.S., to get approval?
Yeah, I think it's very common. I don't know if it's becoming or kind of has been. But it is very commonly used, and I have one client that I'm doing that with right now. We've submitted the second, and we're submitting the third shortly.
Yeah. Okay. It can be very effective when it's laid out carefully. In my experience.
Can I add something on, because I think I understood a part of what you were asking. So you were asking if you collect data, and then that's one part, and then the second part is this clinical decision making based upon the data, right? So I thought about this a lot. And so you actually, I think, depending upon the circumstance, can look for a 510K for the graphical program part of it, but then when you're using the data for clinical decision making, you have to do maybe a class 2 or something, but you can start with the class 1. I'm looking to her because I guess.
Well, and then I was talking with another colleague today that there's the MDDS, which is all about just transferring data, but not doing anything with it per se, and that's a class 1 exempt product. So it's very simple, but because there's software involved, that still has to be developed under design control. And so there's a whole process around that.
Hi, great panel again. Marie, you had just alluded to earlier that there were two types of regulatory folks, and you issued a strong warning not to go with one of them over the other. Could you just elaborate on that?
Sure.
I think
What's a CRO?
Sure.
Yeah.
So a CRO is I guess it stands for Clinical Research Organization, and so these are groups that are set up to help you with your regulatory strategies and then take you all the way through clinical trials. They're really expensive, okay? And it's a little bit at a time, right? It's like fishing. Here's the deal. And I'm going to say this out loud. If there's a CRO here in the room, I'm okay with that. There are two types of CROs. There are bad ones, and there are ones that are going bad. And this is honestly, this is my experience. I picked someone who had a great reputation. And the problem is that once she'd established that, everybody knew that she had a great reputation, so she took on more business than she could handle. So what happens is, when you're using a consultant for this, you just have to remember, you're just another job to them. And so I've convinced myself that having people on staff to do that work is pretty important, because you need to have someone that is absolutely sold out and dedicating 100% of their mind and energy to that. So that's a CRO. And so what they'll do is they'll help you, and then they'll actually run your clinical trial. So that means they'll do all the data monitoring, right, where you go in and you make sure that the clinicians are filling out the data the right way. They'll set up electronic case forms, and they'll, they're traveling, they're training, they're making sure that all the regulatory binders are in place. And so if you're new at it, or if you don't want to take the time, a lot of times people will just use a CRO. So the second type is represented on this panel, and they're the really smart ones, right? A lot of times they'll be lawyers, they're high-level strategists who have a mind for how to not only get you through FDA approval, but also have some market strategy kind of information, then commercialization as well, and then reimbursement. So this person has a lot of talents, and so my suggestion is options are good. Start with options, and then get your employment contracts in place as fast as you can and get them on your team, because they really make a difference.
Just a follow-up on that, would a strategist ever engage CRO?
So what's interesting is the primary strategist that I am working with doesn't even engage the stats person, right? I mean, she's more like a very high-level thinker. Do you?
Peggy,
ever?
you may.
Yeah,
you may
I
wanna address this.
have a comment on that. And for another reason, I actually agree with Marie. Not for more business for myself per se, but going through the clinical process also, I think if you are a small company, these are very important relationships that you're building with these physicians and their team, and I think it can be terrible when you have a CRO that has sort of a churn through of employment because they don't necessarily have long-term employees, and your company is not first and foremost in their mind. They are very busy, crossing T's and dotting I's and filling out reports. It's a lot of paperwork. And they may forget to tell you that, Dr. Smith's coordinator is going to be out on maternity leave, and gosh, I have a new one I need to train, or little details that I think really matter in a startup environment in particular. So if you're a Medtronic, you can use a CRO because there's thousands of them out there, and the relationship is a very low-level relationship. But I think in new companies, new studies, and new relationships, you need a thinker that's out there, that's a higher-level person that can create relationships and bring you feedback, whether it's about the device or the relationship or the process, and fix problems. Somebody that can fix problems. That's the thing I always, when I'm looking for people to be monitors, there's people that are really good at crossing T's and dotting I's, and then there's people that fix problems. I always look for the people that fix problems, because that's your job out there, is to fix the problems, not make more work for the poor doctor and his staff.
I can add just something to that really briefly. I agree, but I would take a different spin on it too. Because we have everything at Nivius. We have our clinical strategy regulatory person. She's great. I do a lot of the stuff myself. As Peggy mentioned, it's great. I do all the site training myself. I do all the site qualification visits myself. I do a lot of it. But we also have a CRO type person. It's not a traditional CRO. It's a smaller boutique shop, more of a clinical consultant. But there's only so much you can do as a startup. Most of us, Marie is, she's a rock star. She does a lot of stuff. She's really great. I can't do data monitoring myself. I don't have any interest in doing data monitoring myself. I have this person that, they're going to go out, they're going to do the data monitoring, they're going to make sure all the regs are adhered to, et cetera. So I think really one takeaway is that it's different for everything that you're doing. And I guess my point that I'm trying to bring up is I would not disregard the CRO type person as not valuable, because in the right situation, the right person, I think they can add a lot of value to a small company that just doesn't have either the funding to bring someone in-house or the expertise to do everything.
One last question.
I had thanks. Great panel, guys. Thank you. I had a question about if you do decide, if your product does need high regulation, it's a 403B de novo or the PMA, and you do decide to go overseas, how do you pick which country that you go overseas?
That's a great question.
So yeah, happy to field that one. So I think it's a mix of a couple of things, but first and absolutely foremost, like if it's a complex disease state or technology or anything like that, probably first and foremost, you need to get good clinical data, and you need to show that the product is safe and that it works. And so the most important person that you're selecting is the PI, the principal investigator, and very close second behind is their staff. And so when I went out looking for the clinical sites to start our trials, I went to a lot of international conferences, met with lots of different physicians, had our scientific advisory board kind of tell us who they trusted, and just vetted different PIs. And then once I vetted them, then I went and actually visited the sites. And if you feel uncomfortable if you just get a funny feeling, even that it's done, that's a no, and you move on to the next one. And you're looking for people with strong track records that you feel very comfortable with, because your company, the life or death of your company, depends on these people coming through. They're not your employees, but they are part of your company. So and then if you're lucky enough that there are a number of investigators that you trust to take on this very important task and work with you, then you optimize it and select a country that you ideally want to commercialize in, because then they can be a training site, a reference site. They can help you with the trials to get reimbursement, because a lot of times each country likes to see, some countries like to see data from their own, within their borders to support reimbursement. So kind of the country is kind of secondary.
Yeah.
Find the best investigator first.
Yeah, I would echo that just as an investor, having watched this movie a few times. I would tell you that if Europe isn't a country, then countries are not primary investigators. They're not people, okay? You need to get somebody who is going to be on your team the way you need them to be on your team. It's very common for us to see a list of countries, okay, coming in the door. And the reaction that we have to that as investors is that whoever's proposing that list of countries doesn't necessarily get what's about to happen, which is you're going to hand the fate of your company over to a couple of individuals, and they may actually be in this country or that country. In fact, I've gone to places I never thought I'd visit because there was a person there, okay? And so I think this is vitally important to
The
execution.
thing we maybe didn't explicitly mention, it's obvious, but optimally that person can publish to or present, right? It has to be-
Absolutely,
That's right.
absolutely, which dovetails with the prior comment.
And really, to build on that too, everything that Darren said about finding the right investigator, the right coordinators, right site, I mean, those same exact principles apply to choosing a U.S. site, to domestic trials. I mean, it's all about the people that are doing it.
Yep.
You should not assume that even the best physician can deploy your product the way that you could in a lab.
That's right. And especially in the beginning, you need them to work with you, because you may need to work out some kinks with your device. And you want them on your side helping to work those kinks out, not throwing up their hands and dropping out of the trial.
That's right.
Great advice. In the interest of time, since we're running short, is there a last comment that you all would share? And maybe I'll end with you, Peggy, since you have the advantage of having seen the movie so many times.
Something you wished you had known when
Something you wished
yes.
you had known, or that has surprised you about the processes that are related to regulatory and clinical, from the entrepreneur's perspective. And then Peggy, we'd ask you to maybe summarize it.
Okay.
Sure. Enrollment takes way longer than you think. Everything takes longer. Approval process takes forever. Budget at least 50% more time than even the most conservative, reasonable person would say, because you can never predict what's going to happen. Enrollment is slow.
Darren?
Prepare for it.
So I would say, beware of the learning cycle that any one product has. So we've talked a lot about clinical trials and regulatory strategy, and PMAs can take longer than 510Ks, et cetera. But be very cognizant of how long does it take when you start a trial to know whether your device is actually working or not. Some things you'll know before the patient gets off the table. Some things you'll know in 30 days. Some things you won't know for 6 months or a year. And think about how that impacts, the cash requirements for your business and how many shots you have on goal. So I'd say that's equally, if not more important than, just the clinical or regulatory path.
Marie?
Probably the fact that overhead comes into play, 43% in some places. And then the second thing, this is going to sound really stupid, but your protocol and your clinical endpoint, they mean it. You have to meet that. I mean, there's no if you say you're going to do 70%, that's what you have to do or better. And you can't realign those goals. And be careful with secondary endpoints because they mean that too. So I think sub-studies are better.
Peggy?
A couple of things I would mention. One that's seen the movie a couple of times, and that is be careful of an early great news out of a clinical trial. And I say that from the perspective is if you're VC backed and you start your studies and you get some great initial results and your financiers then say, great, let's ramp up and get ready to commercialize and manufacture and all of those things. That's a big expenditure, and you need to make sure your product really works in the way you think it does. So that's kind of a movie thing.
Okay.
The other thing I was going to mention to you all that may be new to this space and building new teams is make sure your team understands the regulatory background, things like design control and quality systems, regulations. That way you can all work together more cohesively.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. Very much appreciate it. Thank you all.